All right, welcome back. I'm Scott J. Peterson from Liquid Daffodil, and I'm with Jeff Procyse from Wintellect. How are you?
Doing great.
Long time no see.
Yes, sir.
That was a great last session, but this one's going to get even better. This one we're going to cover Azure Functions and Cognitive Services as part 3 in our web and data application development with Visual Studio and Azure series. And we were talking at the break, this is just getting cooler and cooler. So you ain't seen nothing yet. Wait till the folks see what we're going to do in this one. So the concept up until now is that we've got this great ASP.NET Core app that's available. Users can go out and upload images to it. It's going to caption them, tag them, check for adult and racy content, send them either over to Azure SQL or SQL Server 2016, but we've identified maybe we ought to stick this in object storage for performance and other reasons. And maybe we ought to take advantage of Azure Functions where we can kind of wrap all of this logic in a nano service, right? And stick it up into Azure instead of having to worry about that. So what that's going to take is really a movement to object storage. We're going to have to move some logic into functions, and then we're going to change our code a little bit. But before we do that, let's talk about Azure Functions, another area that a lot of developers just are not familiar with.
I was going to say the same thing. Azure Functions. So today, Azure comprises more than 100 different features and services. It's hard to keep track of it because as a cloud platform, it's just evolving all the time. Azure Functions is one of the newer features. And I believe it's something that as developers become aware of it, what you can do with it and how easy it is to use, I think it's something that they're going to find a lot of use for.
Mm-hmm. And so I know personally, so just since I've been exposed to Azure Functions, maybe the last 6 or 9 months, my mind has moved as I'm creating solutions for real customers, and these are typically enterprise level customers, so we need these heavy use, high scalability, high manageability. I've moved from creating code in an app to creating stuff in a cloud service to moving stuff into an API app to identifying that a lot of this stuff ought to just go out into a function. I mean, this is really the final stage of that process. So API apps are great if you have this full set of services, but if you need this, if you just need some very granular piece of functionality that can be integrated easily in with a workflow, function apps is just really the way to go. And we're going to stick into that function a little bit deeper detail with cognitive services. So we tickled everyone a little bit with doing that image analysis in the last session, but we didn't talk about what was happening. The other thing that we didn't do, I don't know if you noticed or not, is all we did was grab a caption and tags and adult or is racy flag. There's a bunch of data that comes back from cognitive services that we didn't do anything with. For example, you could get dominant colors, you could get things related to what type of image it is. This is a line drawing, this is that. We also have the ability to get thumbnails that we talked about. So now we're really going to utilize all of this, but I don't want to update the schema in SQL Server 2016 to manage all this, so we'll show you a way that you can quickly grab all of this data that comes back and get it indexed for later on. So we're in session 3 now of this, and it's just gonna get better and better. So let's talk about those Azure functions. Okay, so reusable nano services. This almost sounds like a buzzword, but I can't think of a better word for this. They're even smaller than microservices. Reusable nano services, so they really are serverless, and this means that you as a developer don't need to worry about having a server or a target server for it. These are just going to spin up and run. And these are event-based. So the marketing materials say event-based. I'm going to use the term event-based, but really what this means is Azure Functions are designed to respond to something. This could even be a timer trigger. In our example, it's going to respond to an event in object storage. It could respond to an event in Slack or Teams, for example, with a webhook, right? There's a bunch of things like that. Functions can also be chained and nested, and this is really cool. If we have a workflow, this function, based on what happens, could call another function. They could be nested. You could have a parent-child relationship with that, and easily integrated into workflow. So the perfect scenario is Microsoft Flow or Azure Logic apps. These are perfect to stick into a Logic app or into a Flow. And I see personally, I don't know what's really going to happen, But I see this becoming a critical piece of some of the back-end products like SharePoint. I don't really know what's going to happen, but that's, to me, as a SharePoint developer, Azure Functions make a heck of a lot of sense in that. And then the one that I like, full .NET Core support. If you want to have .NET Core support, if you're a .NET Core person, if you know how to write .NET Core functions or methods or code, you can write function apps.
Right, and you're not limited to just writing Azure Functions in C#, right?
Correct. JavaScript, Node.js. You could have, in fact, there are 4 or 5 different languages you can use at this point. The most common would be a Node.js version or a C# version.
Yeah, a lot of Node.js coming into use. You know, I happen to love C#. I know you do too. Not everyone in the world does, so don't think that just because this is part of Azure that if you want to use Azure Functions, you have to write code in C#. There's actually a lot of freedom there for you to use what you already know, what you prefer, and what you're comfortable with.
Although I can't remember when C# didn't exist. I remember that. I can't, that's been so long ago, but I remember having to make the transition to C#. Do you remember that?
Oh, I remember
and now
it
it's
well.
now it's just old school.
I remember it well because I pretty much went from C++ to C#. I did a little stop with Java in between.
And what's C++ again? Was that a language? No, I'm just
Yeah, so you probably know this. Do you know where the name C# came from, right?
It's from the piano key. So I remember, but I don't remember quick enough.
So it's funny, I was talking with some other developers about this the other night, and I was surprised they didn't know where they had forgotten. C++, plus plus. You put the pluses on top of each other.
So now I remember hearing that.
Yeah.
See, so it's a great language with a clever history.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Oh,
so
it
that's
gets even more clever than that.
Yeah, so write that down. There's going to be a quiz later. Where did C# come from?
That's right.
So Azure Functions, so we took a nice little detour there, but it was fun. So Azure Functions right now are all created in the Azure portal. You can create them other places, but right now the tooling and interfaces in the Azure portal. I see this being integrated in all kinds of things later on. In fact, I will not be surprised if we see tools in Visual Studio or add-ins in Visual Studio very shortly. There might even be some extensions out there right now, I don't know. But in general, you create them in the Azure portal and they're managed as an app service. And I say this because it doesn't always show up in the Azure new relationship the same anymore. Now they tend to show up in compute, but they used to actually show up with web API and mobile apps. Function apps used to show up in there. But these are an app service, and when you go out to manage a function app, much of it is going to be managed like an app service. There's a few differences.
Yeah.
Full NuGet support for this. So this actually amazed me that I was going to write a function out there, and then I went out and looked, and basically it's the same as writing a .NET Core app, or actually even a framework app. I can stick all kinds of stuff in here. I mean, I can have JSON. I mean, I can have whatever I want in here if there's a NuGet package.
Are you trying to tell me that I can pull NuGet packages into my Azure Functions?
Absolutely.
Just like I can in Visual Studio?
Absolutely. There's only one difference here. Azure Functions, as of today, still use project.json. Remember, we talked about that in the first session, how the .NET Core, ASP.NET Core C# project now is putting those back in the project. Not sure where that's going to end up, but right now you're still using project.json. So if you just love project.json so much, just write your whole app in Azure Functions. Actually, I don't know if I'd do that. And so .NET Core project concepts are there too. I say this, but now this has changed a little bit. What we have is we have some .NET Core project concepts. We'll see how this changes. Maybe we'll see Azure Function, the way that they're composed, change a little bit as this goes down the road. I don't know. We'll see.
Azure Functions are still fairly new. I actually have a close friend who recently moved over to that team, and they're doing some cool stuff. And you know one of the things I love about Azure and cloud computing in general? Number one, prices never go up. They always go down because of competition. And it's almost like having Christmas every day. You go into the portal, you read the Azure blog, and there's new stuff rolling out all the time. So functions are still young enough and new enough. I feel certain we're going to see some pretty neat innovations in those soon.
And so that is true, because I manage a lot of different subscriptions in Azure, and I notice that I may have 7 or 8 email accounts that are connected to different things, and I always get this Azure service pricing upgrade, and it is always lower. You know, I used to panic, oh no, what's going to happen now? But they're always lower. So the price is just getting better and better. There's new stuff all the time.
Yeah.
In fact, one of the challenges is keeping up with that and giving people assistance, guidance for Azure. And then there's been a new feature that does something that you tried to explain, and now they can do it with one click. That happens all the time. In fact, you may not know it, but right before this session, they added the Azure Object Storage Upload capability, right? So this is brand new as of this morning or yesterday, right?
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Something that every Azure developer has been saying for a while, why isn't it there? And of course we have tools like the Azure Storage Explorer that makes up for it. But yeah, the portal is constantly evolving. It just seems to always get better.
Yep.
So
here's the way, yeah, I'm loving it. So here's the way, of course, you can tell we love Azure Functions. You will too when you get using them. But here's the anatomy, what I'm calling the anatomy of a function. In general, at a bare minimum, you have a run file. This is in C#, this is a CS file, run CS file. You can alternatively have a function file. You pretty much always have a function file, but it is not required. A function file will be called function.json. It's going to be JSON data, and we'll look at that. But it's going to have sort of the mappings. For example, this will be where the code exists that says, listen to this container in this storage location and pull this in. Or listen to, create a webhook and listen to Slack or Team or something like that. These connections, excuse me, is really the way to look at it. And then the third one is this project file, which right now is containing the references for NuGet packages, and we'll take a look at that. And then secondarily, you have app service settings. Remember, these are managed just like a normal Azure app service. So we have app service settings where we can set things like connection strings, API keys, things like that. And one of the benefits here is that a developer could write the code, but a developer may not have the permissions within an organization to manage things like connections or permissions to services. Somebody else could be going out and managing all of those things and have permission to update those things, or as those things change. You may have a function app that could realistically have 100 functions. You don't want to change those in a bunch of places. You can just change them then in your app settings. So there are actually a ton of scenarios and a ton of different types of bindings that you could use for Azure Functions. Just to wet people's whistle, I was going to give them some examples of really the triggers, inputs, outputs for functions so that they get an idea of that. So number one is a schedule. This is kind of a timer. You could say, run this function every 5 minutes. And so I don't know if you're familiar with cron expressions. Cron expressions are getting pretty common. Cron expressions will sort of give you the ability to set these schedules, and Azure is using those very heavily now, these cron expressions. Only limitation that I know of with cron expressions is they can't go less than a minute. So I think that that's still a limitation. We also have an HTTP REST or webhook. This can just be just a URL, almost like a GET or a webhook that can then be connected to something like GitHub or Slack or some other scenarios like that, or an Azure Logic app. Object storage, like we're going to use. We can have this be listening kicked off from an event hub. An event hub may trigger this function when something shows up in this event hub, do this, or in a queue. You know, when a message queue or some kind of a queue gets an entry, kick off this function. Tables in storage tables and mobile app tables. So you can pretty much listen to anything out there. Also, document DB, we can connect that as input and output. So what we're going to show here in this next session is, remember, we have all this great data that's coming back from cognitive services, and if you remember, document DB is schema agnostic. So I can just throw this big piece of possibly complex JSON and I can just throw it into document DB. Document DB will understand it and index it and let us even write queries against it. And what we're going to show later on is attach Azure Search and Luis to that data, and then push notifications through Azure Notification Hub. So we can send this out to a notification hub. And this to me is a cool one where you can have a function that when it gets processed, it notifies you on your device, right? Or it sends a raw notification. And again, this is to any device. So you could say
iOS, Android,
exactly.
Windows, what have you. Exactly right.
Exactly. So if you're watching this and you haven't been using Azure Functions, this should at least give you some idea of all of the ways that you can trigger these and the input and output for that kind of stuff. So here's what we're going to do in this demo. We're going to convert the upload logic from using SQL Server 2016 to Azure Storage. And I'm still going to stick some stuff in Azure 2016 because it's going to be a little bit more fun when we get to Power BI to show a bunch of that stuff. But in general, all that processing now, instead of happening by the upload going to SQL Server and then stopping and analyzing it, all we're going to do in our code mostly is just stick it in Azure Storage, and then the function will do it. We're going to actually go out and write that function. And then we're going to add a reference to the document DB so that we can send that data there. And then we're going to move all the processing logic. So right now we are calling cognitive services in our analysis function in our app. We're going to move all of that up there. We're going to point our function file to this blob, the blob storage we showed earlier as a listener and a receiver. And then we're just going to essentially clean all that code out. So the only thing that's going to happen in our app is just the upload.
Just does the upload, and then
just does the upload, and Azure Functions takes the rest of it.
Every time we drop that blob into blob storage or object storage, the function is going to execute, right? Because of the binding that we set up. It's easy to see why people who are interested in microservices and nanoservices can be so excited about this. I mean, I think about how much we've done in recent years to move away from pure procedural code, and this is sort of the cloud version of that in a way, right?
Yep.
Let's see if it actually works. I can't wait to see this.
All right, let's do it.